So I hate training gaps. And for some reason, sports medicine people just can't get their heads around. They seldom understand the complexity of world-class training systems. They have zero understanding of training gaps. So what happens with an acute injury or a surgery? I want you to do pool workouts, and here's 10 PT exercises, and 8 to 10 weeks. Chemistry's changing. They're detraining all kinds of things. Our idea is we're going to train like you're not hurt. We're going to come up with a plan B or a plan C where we stay on the original plan. We're going to be as close to movement as possible. I got a grade 2 hamstring. Okay, we're going to do walking drills, and we're going to do dribbles at different speeds and different displacements and different symmetries of recovery, where we're putting a little bit of pressure on the system, but we're not injuring the system. But so many times, people just radically change channels. What is a 320-pound shot putter going to do in a pool workout that helps him as a shot putter? He's not going to float real well, first of all. So his ergonomic work rate is going to be through the roof. He's going to use energy systems that he doesn't use. You know how long it takes to go across a shot put circle and throw? It's a couple seconds, tops if they're slow as shit. And they're in the pool for 30 minutes. Like, yeah, well, it's rehab. Well, it's stupid. So plan B, menu items, we feel have to remain as close to plan A as possible. And I think this is a huge issue, a huge mistake. So this is Scott Morehouse. He's a javelin thrower, Paralympian, GB. And he came in, and when we got there in England, they babied Paralympians. You can't do this, you can't do that, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. So, he gets his workout and he goes, Coach, I can't clean. I'm like, well, why can't you clean? He goes, well, the prosthetic. I said, well, single leg clean. Well, how do you do that? And what about my other leg? I said, do you know what cross education is? No. I said, well, here's some reading. Read on it. So this is first week, single leg clean. And this was a guy that wasn't allowed to clean and told he couldn't clean, and he's cleaning. So he couldn't do plan A because he's missing something, but he can do plan B. So injury patterns, they can be top down or bottom up, Atlas occipital, TMJ, can create all kinds of problems. Drop talus, frozen cuboid, sprig ligament torsion on the navicular, big problems. Like we already talked about ilium, sacrum, SI. So these various rudders of the ship in human movements, cervicals, mid-thoracic, which Kelly did a nice job of Monday, pelvis, and feet. People say, well, how do you start looking at movement and all of that? Those are the first rudders that we look at every day. When they're walking from the car park, I'm scanning. What's their head doing? How's their neck moving? What's going on in the hips? What's going on in the feet? What's happening with the shoulders and mid-thoracic? So axes of movement are critical. A longitudinal axis of the body, transverse axis of the shoulder, the hip, longitudinal axis of the foot. What's happening pronation, supination along that long axis. So when we're looking at movement, we're always analyzing axes. Long axis of the body, what kind of oscillation and undulation is there occurring? So when we sprint, the shoulder axis and the hip axis actually undulate and oscillate as we move down the track in opposite phasic. So the hip on the knee lift side is higher and in front of the support leg, and then it interfaces. So there's undulation and oscillation of the hips as you run, and the shoulders are in opposite phasic. Well, guess what? There's a mesh point there that's in the lower thoracic where there has to be rotation. And if you don't angulate the arms in harmony with the legs, that fulcrum moves down, and now the lumbar are picking up the rotational torque. Lumbar will take rotation, but they don't like it. They want to do flexion extension. So a lot of lower leg injuries are coming because the fulcrum is wrong in the spine when they're moving. So these axes and these fulcrums, I think, are critical. And then tensegrity. How many people are familiar with the word tensegrity? If not, you probably ought to figure it out. To me, the human body is just a big tensegrity puzzle. And what's cool is biochemistry has a lot to do with these connectors. And then fluid dynamics have a lot to do with how these connectors and these levers move. So you can't get reductionist and isolate on an entity or a principle because they're all harmonic and dynamic. I think biochemistry is delicate and not really understood. No disrespect, John. And I think it's easily influenced, both positively and negatively. One person can take supplement X, have great results. For another person, it could open Pandora's box for problems. One training menu item may work beautifully on this athlete. For another athlete, disaster. KPIs. What is a key performance indicator? To me, it's a double-edged sword. I think they're real, and I account for them daily. And I think the double-edged sword is there's things that we do that indicate progress or good performance, and there's things that we can do that inhibit. So when we do KPI analysis, we're looking for things that are promotive, but also inhibitive. So what are some of the KPIs we place upon the athletes and our performance staff to monitor? Technical, obviously. We have a model for everything we do, every menu item. If we're doing a lift, we have KPIs for that lift. If we're doing a warm-up drill, we got KPIs for it. If we're doing a multiple throw, we have KPIs for that menu item. So whatever the menu item is, there's a technical model that we're teaching towards or that we're using to analyze efficiency and functionality. There's physiological and genetical KPIs. So when we were talking with Jeremy, we had a girl that was 0 for 5 on recovery genes. So that genetics drives the programming. This girl doesn't recover. She can't train every day or back-to-back days. Wellness. Some of the wellness and lifestyle, they oftentimes interface. Sleep hygiene, diet, nutrition, social stressors, relationships. How many of us coach an athlete, abusive relationship, they get out of it and you go, thank you. And you look up a month later and they're in one that's even worse. And you're like, well, I think my programming's off. Your programming's off, they're off. Sorry, not PC, but they're off. How you deal with the off, that maybe John's talk's a better way to do it, but sometimes I'm like, you're just off. Like, we got a problem here. You don't see this pattern. Mental, emotional KPIs. So Greg and I and Kyle kind of team coach, and we had 5 what I call elite vaulters this year, female. And physiologically, they had some sickness, illness, all that, but they were ready. Physically, they were fine. Technically, they had meets or practices where they were world class. But we told them at the beginning of the year, your emotional control and mental resilience are your KPIs for the year. And they tried, and they worked things and all that, but they didn't get there. And so at their various Olympic trials or whatnot, it wasn't that they had bad coaching or they weren't in shape or their technique or their model was wrong. The KPIs for mental and emotional strength, functionality failed. Now, some of that's on us as coaches. A lot of it's on them, how they weren't transparent or didn't work it as well as they could. And then lastly, like environmental and sport knowledge KPIs. You'd be shocked when we interview athletes coming into this program, we go, do you know who the top 5 people are in your event? Nope. So you don't even know how they train? Nope. Do you know what their performance cluster is for the season? Nope. Do you know what their performance cluster is for headwinds? Nope. Tailwinds? Nope. Bad weather? Nope. Do you know any of their lifting metrics? Nope. Like, then how do you tell me you want to go to the Olympics, you don't even know where the map is. So sometimes sport knowledge and environmental KPIs are a big limiter. If you don't know what your opponents are doing, what's a SWOT analysis? If you don't know what your opponents are doing, how are you going to play, or how are you going to judge success or progress or whatever? What are you training towards if you don't know what you're training to? So I think mental training, it's got to be complex, it's got to be systematic, and it's regularly practiced. So a lot of these girls that we were talking about previously got super serious with a month to go using sports psychology and following coaching guidelines. Greg even printed a shirt that said "but." You know, why did he have a shirt that said "but"? Because they would come down and do something and they'd hit the KPI we're working on, they get out of the pit and they say, "But I felt this." You know, instead of focusing and rewarding themselves for the KPI, they're on to the next channel. They're over managing. So the regular was neglected, whether it was cost or time or, you know, there's a myriad of excuses, but it wasn't regular. If it's not regular, it's obviously not systematic. So there's plenty of research being done on that sort of thing with military. I think personally training groups and integrated sport teams are essential. And I think that's part of the reason why Altis has had a couple of good years, is because we have good performance teams and we have good training groups, and people feed off each other, and it speeds up the learning curve. And a lot of time in debrief settings or peer reviews, you know, a peer will say something, the same thing we've said as a coach 100 times, because it's coming from a peer phrased a different way with the contextual support. Boom, the light bulb goes off. So, you know, I fight a lot of federations. They want us to train at a main training center. I'm like, but there's nobody there. Like, who are we going to train with? And we want you to be in this meet series. And I'm like, okay, I got a 690 long jumper, and the next long jumper is 605. How's that going to help us? So, having peer and uniform groups, I think, pretty important. So we demand that athletes become PhD here. You know, when they leave or retire or whatever, we want them to know the gauntlet: biomechanics, motor learning, therapies, sports medicine, nutrition, whatnot. Because it raises the level of reporting, it raises the level of debriefing. We want people at a very high level. A comment we get from ACP coaches: the athlete is warming up, sit down on the training table, tell the therapist X, Y, and Z, and then they're like, wow, like my athlete doesn't even know where the hamstring is. You know, well, they didn't start out that way. It's a culture that you have to teach and develop and promote. And I believe strongly athletes must take extreme ownership. I think John referred to it yesterday in his lecture. You know, coaches can't be working at it harder than the athlete. And you say, oh, it's kind of cliche and that's a given, but how many of us hold athletes to this accountably every day, every cycle, every year, every competition? It doesn't have to be like white knuckle accountability, no, but you have to call bullshit when it's bullshit. This is a hard one for me. I'm a slow learner. It took me about 10 years before I figured this out. But I truly believe this. And you think at 44 years and the record and CV I got, it should be easy. It's not. I got probably half my team, every day I got to convince them that what I'm thinking is even close to being true. So it's a trust project, and you know, whether it's academic knowledge or conversational tone or the techniques that John referred to yesterday, all of those things go into the equation for building this. If you think just because you move up the ladder and you're working at a certain facility and you got a bunch of letters behind your name that you're going to be accepted and believed, you haven't worked long enough, in my opinion. Is that earth-shattering to people? How many people already knew this? Yeah. For me, the best form of training is doing the event. I think drills and teaching progressions give context. They build file systems. They can develop routing, main trunk routing and all of that. But transference is optimized when you're doing the real thing at real time, real forces, real task. So we have pole vaulters that do hours of gymnastics and plyometrics and all of this. And they may have a place, they may add context. Like if you're a young pole vaulter learning body control and movements and how to change levers and all that, the gymnastics may have a higher ranking in the KPI list. But if you're a world-class pole vaulter and you're 30 years old, this is wasted heartbeats. Totally wasted. This guy's running 9.3 meters per second. When he plants the pole, 5 to 6 times body weight going through his spine. There's actually whiplash on his skull and neck at takeoff. And then he hangs his underwear upside down at 6 meters on a pole that's moving in 3 dimensions. And he lands in the pit and gets whiplash again. So a pole vaulter undergoes double whiplash every jump with 5 to 7 times body weight forces. And then the force from falling from 6 meters, I haven't figured that one out. And you're going to tell me this shit prepares you for that. It fails the logic test, doesn't it? Now watch what happens to his head and neck and his spine. Now watch the pole. It's bending all over the place. It's crazy. The wind's blowing him, he's got to contort. Now, how are you going to do that on a fixed apparatus? I think the best form of event-specific training is competing. And people don't respect competing. Like, when you compete, you're doing it all. You're doing accelerations, you're doing plyometrics, you're doing speed. You're doing mobility, you're doing all kinds of stuff at a super high level. And so people will compete on Saturday and they come back, well, it's Monday, we got to train. I'm like, no, don't train. You just went through supra training. And why do we have the problems we have in soccer in Europe? Too many comps, no time to recover. They're not understanding that this is super high training. So this is a Korean guy, he was bronze medalist at World Juniors. This kid, it was really interesting. He could not jump 2 meters in practice. Like, couldn't jump it. He could go to a big meet like this and jump 224 because his timing and his systems and all of that needed that stimulus to get that kind of workout in. And the coaches were like, he's weak in the weight room, he's failing the plyometric test, and his mobility tests are terrible. And you know, we've done the, what is that, Omega Wave, and he's not ready for training, and all this science shit. And I said, guys, every major you put him in, he's medaled. There's something else going on here that you guys are overrating, like training. Training's way overrated. You laugh. I think we're married to numbers. We got to train 6 days a week, 2 or 3 times a day. Really, do you? I got plenty of examples where I'll show you you're wrong. So I think competitions train many systems and many menu items simultaneously. Sport-specific and event group classification things. So when we look at athletes, we look at body prototypes like injury risk factors, architectural factors, anthropological, biological systems. These are just some of the grids that we analyze athletes to put them in a mailbox. So let's use long jumpers for an example. There's about 5 mailboxes you can put a long jumper in. So we got one, Fabrice Lapierre, Australian. He's about 5'10", 145 pounds. No muscle mass. 100K power clean would be like a great day, high fives. Fast as hell, elastic as hell. Work capacity, 0. Like, if he does a jump session, you better give him about 5 days off. He's a greyhound. He's a thoroughbred. So he's one mailbox. And you got Greg Rutherford, the British guy. So Fabrice was silver at Worlds last year. Greg was gold. Greg, thick, medium converter, fast, powerful, like 26 meters overhead back throw with a 4K shot. What was his step up the other day? 250 kilos on a low box step up. He can clean 150K. But he's got architectural problems. He's pigeon-toed and bow-legged. So he's had 17 grade 2 hamstring tears on one leg, 15 on the other, 4 or 5 foot surgeries on one, and all that. He's got a Maserati engine and a Volkswagen chassis. So all of these things determine which mailbox they're in. Christabel Nettie, our Canadian jumper, she's kind of the middle on everything. A middle converter, middle speed, middle power, middle work capacity. She's kind of in that middle mailbox. So you got to know what mailbox to drive programming. Can I train any of these guys alike? So we got 6 people going to the Olympics, and there's some essentials and common denominators out there, but none of the 6 workout even look remotely possible. So today nobody was out there. We had one guy do a pre-meet warm-up and another guy did an Excel workout. And 3 others were totally off. Because they're different. They have different body prototypes. So when we look at body systems, these are some of the things, you know, that we monitor and look at and that we use as touchstones and signposts for programming and classifying athletes. So we use generational menu item selection schemes with all training qualities. So the best way to think about generational menus is like a family tree, like a family history. So this is a tree I found in Japan. And every generation they graft a different genus and species on this thing, and the net is pretty incredible. So we use generational constructs. So some training menu items are teaching progressions to higher degrees of specificity, so they're lower generation. If we're doing a drill or a teaching progression, that might be 5th generation away from the 1st generation. The 1st generation is doing your event in the Olympic Stadium. The 5th generation may be doing a drill or a warm-up exercise or an ancillary lift. So some training menu items serve as mental or neurological or brain plasticity reference points or perceptual grids. But they don't ensure transference. They build filing systems and routing systems, but they don't ensure transference. Some of these training items will build platforms for more special work, more specific work. So do we do general types of work? Yeah. Do we spend a lot of time on it? No. Is the density great? No. We're doing it to build platforms. So the dosage of it depends on what you're trying to do with it. So let's look at a pole vaulter, for example. So competition length vault is 1st generation. Are you coming from 18 to 20 strides? How high is your grip? What's the flex of the pole? What are the weather conditions? It's shit and get time. And people can die in the pole vault if you don't pay attention, so it's serious. So that's 1st generation. 2nd generation would be short run jumps and exercises like moving the standards, being on a soft pole, being on a stiff pole, but it's a reduced run, and maybe it's 10 steps or 12 steps. So we have a little lower velocities, a little less forces. 3rd generation would be things that support that work. So acceleration runs, speed runs, various jump and plyometric exercises. 4th, general plyometrics, weight training, gymnastics, alactic runs. Why? Well, 12 jumps, 90 minutes, you may get into an alactic factor there. Notice there's no anaerobic work in here. There's no classic aerobic work in here. They're like 10th generation. Why are we going to spend time on it? Like a high jumper takes 12 jumps in an Olympic final over a 90-minute period. They run 30 meters. Why do they need anaerobic capacity? So very little general or fifth generational work. And any of these lower generations, we've got to see that they truly support the first two generations. Does that make sense? So we respect dynamic systems modeling, but I got some questions. So this is all the rage now, dynamic systems and variance and all that. Like, how much variance do you need? So I don't know how it is with your clients or athletes, but my athletes come and they're never the same. Like sleep, diet, nutrition, stressors, weather, injuries, compensation patterns, they're already different today than they were yesterday. We got headwinds today. Well, maybe that's enough variance. Like, do we have to put even crazier variance? Some things are more operative in open chain versus closed chain. Okay, I understand some dynamic system variance there. But one of the things that I see working with a lot with middle distance runners is, do they have landmark workouts? Do they have workouts throughout the year where they know where they're at? They don't have to be the same workout, but they need to be in the same family. So many people are into variance and keeping it interesting, and I got ADD people, so I got to change shit up. Like, they never know where they're at. Like, think about it. Guys in here that lift or whatever, you got some key workouts that let you know where you're at. You got these time tested, and if I do 5x2 on the bench, I kind of know where I'm at or something like that. Athletes need those landmark sessions. And organizational adapter spectrums, like, how are we adapting in an organizational sense with these dynamic systems? So we constantly monitor staff and athletes for conformational bias, and I'm pretty guilty of this. I mean, you have this aha moment, it's like, I did all this research and all that, I already knew that. Like GPS, I was working with an NFL team, and they gave me the GPS data, and it was like, these guys can't do X. I'm like, well, that's obvious. Like, they didn't even finish practice. you needed all this technology to tell you this guy can't do X. So that's it. A lot of other layers and things like that, and it's a big ticket item on my journey and where we sit today. So we're going to take a 10-minute break so we can kind of reorganize, and then I'll take questions and whatnot on the pool side. All right.